1 Shot Toothpaste. "I'm afraid this tooth will have to be filled," said Mr. Bin. "It's badly decayed." Antonio's knees started to knock as he looked at the dentist's arm. He knew that Mr. Bin was hiding a needle behind his back. "Not an injection, not that," spluttered Antonio, but it was too late. Before he could say another word, the numbing needle was doing its work. Antonio could feel tears springing into his eyes. He stared helplessly out of the window at a huge white tooth that was swinging in the breeze. On the side of it, it was written, M.T. Bin, Dentist. The needle seemed to be taking years to go in. Mr. Bin held Antonio's mouth open with one hand and slowly pushed the plunger with the other. "Try not to move," he said. "You're shaking like a leaf." At last it was over. The dreaded needle came out. "Rinse," ordered Mr. Bin. Antonio took a mouthful of water from the glass and tried to spit it out, but his mouth was numb and he dribbled most of it down his t-shirt. Antonio fought back the tears as Mr. Bin started up the drill. He mustn't cry. It wouldn't be right for a 13-year-old boy to cry at the dentist's. He stared out of the window again at the giant tooth sign and opened his mouth. "What are you going to do for a job when you leave school?" asked Mr. Bin. "A dustman," answered Antonio. "I've always wanted to be a dustman." Mr. Bin put down the drill with an amazed look on his face. "A dustman? Did you say a dustman? Now, isn't that funny? I always wanted to be a dustman when I was a boy." "Well, how come you ended up a dentist then?" Antonio asked. The dentist looked around the room and then went over and shut the door. He spoke in a very soft voice. "If you promise not to tell anyone, I'll tell you the story, seeing that you want to be a dustman too. But you must give me your solemn promise not to tell any other person. Not a soul. Do you promise?" Antonio nodded. He couldn't say a word because Mr. Bin had already started drilling away inside his mouth. He closed his eyes and listened. "When I was a boy," said Mr. Bin, "I loved looking in rubbish bins. I just couldn't walk past one without opening it. I mean, there are really some wonderful things to be found in the garbage. Once I found a dead pig's head in our neighbour's bin. I took it home and put it on an ant's nest. They ate all the flesh off, and I was left with just the skull. Next, I drilled a hole in the top of it and gave it to my mother for a sugar container. She liked it so much that she never used it. She hid it away in a special place and then forgot where it was. All the bins in our street had something interesting about them, but old Monty's rubbish was the strangest. I used to look in this garbage bin every Wednesday and Friday, and it was always filled with the same thing. Empty toothpaste tubes. Dozens and dozens of them. They weren't your everyday tubes either. They always had the same label. 1 Shot Toothpaste was written on every one. I could never work out why one old man who lived all alone would use so many tubes of toothpaste. He couldn't have spent all day cleaning his teeth, or I should say tooth, for he only had one fusty old green tooth right in the middle of his mouth. In fact, his tooth was so scrungy that I'm sure he had never cleaned it since the day it first grew. I couldn't stop thinking about old Monty and his empty toothpaste tubes. I just had to find out what was going on. I knew it would be no good trying to talk to him because he hated children. Actually, I think he hated everyone. If you said, "Good morning," to him, he would just tell you to clear off. In the end, I decided to sneak up to his house at night and peek in the window. Chapter 2. One night, after my parents had gone to bed, I crept up the side of old Monty's house. It was a ramshackle, tumble-down old joint with a rusty tin roof and cobwebs all over the windows. It was a dark night and a cold wind was blowing. I was covered in goosebumps, but they weren't from the cold. I was scared stiff. I stumbled around until I found a window which had a chink between the curtains. Then I stood on tiptoe and peered inside. All was black in the room, and at first I couldn't see anything. After a minute or two, however, I noticed something eerie, something strange, something I'd never seen before. Teeth. I saw teeth. About 20 sets of teeth were glowing palely in the dark. They were so white that they shone like tiny dim light globes in the blackness. They hovered in the air at various heights, above the floor like fierce kites on strings. They were opening and shutting and waving around as if they belonged to invisible heads and bodies. I just couldn't see them because it was dark. The teeth were so clean they gave off their own light. There were large pointed teeth and tiny sharp ones. There was every type of cruncher and chopper that you could think of except one. None of them belonged to people. There were no human teeth. I could tell that at once. Just then, someone lit a candle, and an amazing sight met my eyes. I saw a room filled with animals. There were rabbits, dogs, kangaroos, wallabies and cats, each one in its own cage, and each one possessed the whitest set of teeth I had ever seen. But the poor things, they all looked so sad. I could tell they hated being kept in those small cages. And even more, they hated what was about to happen next. Monty strode across the room with an evil grin on his face and a candle in his hand. "Tooth time, boys," he croaked. I could almost feel the poor animals shiver as he said it. He put the candle on a table and went over to a large cupboard and opened it. Inside were thousands of tubes of toothpaste. He took down one of the boxes. "Number 52A, he said. "Let's see if this is the mix that will make my fortune." Monty went over to a cage of a small rabbit and pressed a button. A red light flashed inside the cage, and the rabbit poked its head out of a hole in the wire. The rabbit screwed up its nose and bared its teeth. Monty put some of the toothpaste on a brush and scrubbed away at them. I could tell that the toothpaste tasted terrible. When Monty had finished, he threw a dirty old carrot to the rabbit, but the poor thing couldn't eat. He was too busy trying to get the nasty taste out of its mouth. This was terrible. This was monstrous. How cruel. That mean old man was cleaning the teeth of animals with some foul-tasting toothpaste. He was trying it out on them to see if it was any good. I didn't think of my own safety. I didn't think of anything except those frightened creatures. I raced around to the front door and banged on it as hard as I could. "Let me in!" I screamed. "Let me in and those animals go!" Chapter 3. The door swung open, and there stood Monty, grinning at me with his fusty green tooth. He seemed pleased to see me. "Just what I need," he said. "A cheeky brat of a kid. Come in, boy, and welcome." I burst into the house and ran into the room where the animals were kept. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "Why are you cleaning these animals' teeth?" "I'm inventing Shot Toothpaste," grinned Monty. "And I'm nearly there." "What's Shot Toothpaste?" I shouted. "It's toothpaste that you only use once in your life. One go, and you never need to clean your teeth again. Everyone will buy it once it's invented. All those brats who won't clean their teeth. Their parents will all buy it, and I will be rich. Every time I make a new batch, I have to try it out. That's why I have the animals." "Let the animals go," I said. "It's cruel. Try your rotten old toothpaste out on yourself." "I could do that," said Monty. "It tastes horrible. But now I don't need the animals anymore. I have you." He looked at me with a sneaky smile and pointed to an empty cage. Before I had a chance to move, he jumped on me and grabbed me with his skinny hands. He was thin but very strong. We rolled over and over on the floor and crashed into the cupboard. Hundreds of tubes of toothpaste fell out of the cupboard and showered all over us. As we struggled on the floor, many of the tubes burst open and squirted long worms of toothpaste into the air. Soon we were both covered in every colour of toothpaste you could possibly think of. They all got mixed up and the different types smeared into horrible, smelly puddles. Monty grabbed the toothbrush and dipped it in the mixture. "See how you like this, boy," he hissed as he tried to shove the brush into my mouth. There was no way I was going to let him put that mixed up toothpaste mixture on my teeth. I pushed Monty backwards and he fell against the wall with a grunt. He was winded and he lay there gasping for breath. "Have a bit of your own medicine," I said. I plunged the toothbrush into Monty's mouth and brushed at his fusty old green tooth. Chapter 4. He didn't like it. Not one bit. He rolled around on the floor, screaming and yelling and holding his hands up to his neck. It must have tasted foul. Then something happened I will never forget. Monty's tooth started to grow. It swelled up and started to stick out of his mouth. Soon it was as big as his head. A whopping big green fusty tooth. And as it grew, Monty started to shrink. It was just as if the tooth was sucking the insides out. Monty shriveled up like a slowly collapsing balloon as the tooth grew bigger and bigger. Soon it was bigger than he was. It wasn't Monty and a tooth. It was a tooth and Monty. The tooth continued to feed on Monty until it was as big as a full-grown man. And he was only the size of a pea on the end of it. There was a small little pop, and he was gone altogether. The super tooth lay there alone on the floor. I was in a daze and I didn't know what to do. I staggered over to the cages and let the animals out, one at a time. Each one bounded out of the door in a panic. The last to go was a big kangaroo. The poor thing was in such a fright that it knocked over the table with the candle on it. In a flash, the curtains caught on fire and the room was alight. The animals had all fled into the night, so I grabbed the huge tooth and lugged it out onto the lawn. The house burned to the ground before the fire brigade could even get there. "And that," said the dentist to Antonio, "is the end of the story. And your filling is finished. It didn't hurt much, now did it?" No, said Antonio. I didn't feel a thing. But what happened to the giant tooth? Mr. Bin looked up at the large tooth swinging in the breeze outside with M.T. Bin, dentist, written on it, and said, That is a secret which I can't tell even you. Antonio walked outside and looked at the large tooth sign. It was painted white, but on one corner the paint was peeling off. Underneath, he could see that it was a fusty green colour. He turned round and walked home, shaking his head as he went. Mr. Bin went back into his surgery. A small girl was sitting on the chair crying. No needles, please, she whimpered. What are you going to do for a job when you grow up? Asked Mr. Bin. A ballet dancer, said the little girl. Mr. Bin put down the needle with an amazed look on his face. A ballet dancer? Did you say a ballet dancer? Now, isn't that funny? I always wanted to be a ballet dancer when I was a boy. Well, how come you ended up a dentist? The girl asked. Mr. Bin looked around the room and then went over and shut the door. He spoke in a very soft voice. If you promise not to tell anyone, I'll tell you the story, he said as he picked up the needle. Okay, that's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time for the next story. Bye.